Here are my reasons for worrying about Donald Trump. And I say this as someone who understands everyone's reservations about Clinton. But one thing you can't say about her is that she is not qualified, or that she is profoundly ignorant of how the world works, okay, or that she's unintelligent. Okay, these are not things you can say about her, no matter how much you hate her personally. President Obama just endorsed her today, and he said, "I don't think there's ever been someone so qualified to hold this office." Now, perhaps that's slightly hyperbolic, right? But it's not a crazy thing to say. Imagine someone saying that of Trump. That would be a statement so rankly partisan and propagandistic as to be indistinguishable from mental illness. It is a claim that cannot be made with a straight face. That difference matters. In fact, what you could say of Trump is the exact opposite. He is perhaps the least qualified candidate we have ever had for that office. I'm not a historian. Perhaps there's somebody I'm not thinking of, but that's not far from true. It is certainly true in our lifetime. What I object to in Trump isn't his bigotry or misogyny or demagoguery even. Now, I think I share many people's opinion that this is partly an act. And I don't know why I think that. It's just a hunch. I don't know the man, and I don't know anyone who knows him, or at least I'm not aware of knowing anyone who knows him. But I would not be at all surprised to learn that he is far more liberal and psychologically balanced than he appears, and that he doesn't actually have a racist bone in his body, for instance. This strikes me as possible. What does not strike me as possible is that he might actually be a brilliant and extraordinarily knowledgeable person who is qualified to be President of the United States. There is simply too much evidence for the poverty of his thinking. There's too much evidence for the fact that he basically knows nothing about the world, and that he does not care that he knows nothing about it. He's just winging it. He gives the overwhelming impression of being a con man. The journalist Michael Kinsley once said of Al Gore that he was an old person's idea of a young person. That was certainly fitting. I think you could say of Trump that he is a poor person's idea of a rich person. I mean, he's the fat cat in the comic strip. He brags about how much money he has, all the while probably lying about how much money he has. But he'll stand at the podium and say, "I am rich, I am so rich, I am really, really rich." And people applaud. Who is applauding this? And at the core of this, the core of what bothers me about Trump is the vacuousness of his speech. He will literally say the same thing 3 times in a row, and it was meaningless the first time. The problem is the caricatures of him are true. He'll say, "It's going to be amazing. You won't believe how amazing it will be. It will be very, very amazing." This is an intellectual problem. Okay, smart people don't talk this way. When people are speaking, they're thinking out loud. I am thinking out loud at this moment. If you've listened to my podcast for a few hours, you know how I think. So when people don't make sense, it's not like they're thinking brilliant, incisive thoughts in the privacy of their minds, and then they just sound like dummies when they open their mouths. Generally speaking, what you hear is what they've got. Yes, it's true that not every smart person is a great public speaker. And you can find great public speakers who are essentially just reading what some smarter person wrote. But it is significant that Trump never manages to utter a single extemporaneous string of sentences that is deep, insightful, or even interesting. This reveals something about him. And this is a point I made on Rogan's podcast, and I think I'll give you the same analogy here. Imagine you have an urn, and every time you reach into it, you pull out another piece of junk. You've just got broken glass and zip ties and bits of bone, right? Nothing of value. Well, while it might seem unlikely, it's not impossible that something of tremendous value is also in there. You could pull the Hope Diamond out of there if you just keep fishing around long enough. Now, that's possible, because what you pull out in each round doesn't really indicate what else is in there. Minds are not like that. Okay, ideas are connected. The ability to reason well, for instance, is transferable from one domain to another, and so is an inability to reason. A desire not to seem incoherent. This is something that intelligent, well-informed people tend to have. Okay, well, when you hear someone speak at length on topics that are crucial to the most important enterprise they're engaging, and all they've got is bluster and bombast and banality, strewn with factual errors, it is quite irrational to believe that there's a brilliant mind behind all of that, just waiting to get out. Trump is not hiding his light under a bushel. He's all bushel. And bizarrely, I've heard from many people who think that because he is rich, he must be deeply knowledgeable about economics, at the very least. No. And you should read what largely conservative economists have written about the prospects of a Trump presidency. They are terrified of this. The idea that we might want to default on our national debt, that we can renegotiate it, as though the United States were a golf course or a casino that was going under. We're talking about a world destabilizing bit of stupidity, and only one of many that he's given voice to. And as far as the war against global jihadism is concerned, many of you are confused, frankly, about the superficial similarity between his positions, if I can call them that, or the noises he has made on these topics, and the kinds of views I've expressed in the past. Yes, I've said that under certain conditions, torture would be ethical. In fact, that you'd have to be a moral monster not to use force to get someone to talk. I've said this in the context of believing that torture should always be illegal. We should have a policy that we don't use it. And the cases I've described are absolute corner conditions where somebody would be moved to break the law and we wouldn't prosecute them because we would recognize at the end of the day that it was ethical to do so. Who knows when or if these situations would emerge? And I've largely written about all of this in the context of trying to understand ethics more deeply. Trump is a presidential candidate who is bragging about how he will torture people. I wouldn't think I would have to go into all that is wrong with that. This would be disastrous for our standing in the world. I am someone who has bemoaned our political correctness about the connection between Muslim violence and the doctrine of Islam. And Trump is someone who seems to speak with refreshing candor on this topic. He's even said that we should bar all Muslims from entering the United States, if only for a time. Well, apart from being a totally unworkable, unethical, and needlessly inflammatory policy prescription, the deeper issue is that it is just absolutely obvious that Trump doesn't know anything about Islam or jihadism. He is an ignoramus on this topic and every topic related to it, and it is obvious. At one point, he was confusing the Quds Force with the Kurds, right? This guy's head is not in the game. Now, I'm sure he's going to cram for the final exam before the debates with Clinton, and he will be able to speak a paragraph on this topic that isn't starkly delusional. But if pushed beyond that paragraph, he will once again expose his basic ignorance of Middle East politics and history and the theology of Islam. And while it is true that Clinton spoons out the most sanctimonious pablum on the topic of Islam, there is abundant evidence that she understands the nature of the problem. She is, in fact, far more hawkish than most liberals are comfortable with. She has already shown a commitment to killing jihadists, every bit as much of a commitment as Trump claims to have. Yes, the fact that Middle Eastern governments have given money to the Clinton Foundation, that is politically indecent. Do I think that will cloud Clinton's judgment in the war on terror? That does not seem likely at all. Even if I thought that were likely, Trump is a scarier prospect. The truth is, Clinton could rectify her relevant past missteps with a single speech. Trump couldn't, Trump could not give a speech which rectified all of his crazy pronouncements in the past. There have been so many of them. He would have to disavow his very being. Clinton could give a speech wherein she honestly talked about what we got wrong in Iraq and how she views the limitations of American power going forward, as well as the necessity of our remaining central to world order, where she talked about the ideological link between certain interpretations of Islam and the global phenomenon of jihadism, where she held Saudi Arabia largely culpable for exporting this ideology, and where she reaffirmed her commitment to defending Western values against their antagonists, in particular the antagonist of Islamic theocracy. And needless to say, she could say before, during, and after her speech that most American Muslims don't want to live under a theocracy any more than she does. But she has to make it clear that free speech and women's rights and gay rights and our other core political values dominate any concern over religious sensitivity. And she must acknowledge that we are lucky to not be sharing in the convulsions of Europe at the moment. Admit that there is a problem in Belgium and France and Germany where the best intentions of Western liberalism appear to have met their match. Admit that there is a real concern here. Admit that you don't have to be a bigot or a racist or a xenophobe to want to keep Islamists and jihadists out of our society. Admit this, and any apparent moral high ground that Trump holds on this issue evaporates. Now, in response to anything I might say against Trump, his supporters will raise Clinton's email scandal, say. This is a concern of a totally different order than the ones I've voiced against Trump. Trump has ideas that are extraordinarily destructive, and he has a relationship to his own ignorance that is dangerous. He thinks the notion of human-caused climate change is a Chinese hoax meant to destroy our manufacturing base. The prospect of a president believing that is terrifying. Clinton's email scandal, what do you actually think was going on there? Do you think she's a spy? You think she was sharing state secrets with the Russians? No, she wanted to keep her email private and didn't understand the implications of running stuff on her own server. It was a sloppy, stupid thing to do. With Trump, we're talking about somebody who has ideas about what our nation should do that are anchored to nothing other than his own personal urges. This is a guy who spent months and months publicly worrying about President Obama's birth certificate. If you want to understand how deep his anti-intellectualism runs, consider the fraud of Trump University, where he bilked poor and elderly people out of their money in return for pseudo-knowledge. This is who Clinton is running against. We have to get out of the wilderness of false equivalence here. Yes, there's a lot to say about Clinton, and if you're going to bring her husband into it, there's just a wasteland of embarrassment there. But these are not the sorts of things that could push the career of our species into the ditch. Trump shows every sign of being that sort of character, where a combination of hubris and ignorance of a sort that we have never seen could create extraordinary economic and political chaos. There is nothing like that on Clinton's side. Hence, a lesser of two evils argument makes perfect sense here. The amazing thing about Trump is that he is so terrible that he has completely reset everyone's expectations of what is conceivably acceptable in a presidential candidate. You've seen the footage of him openly mocking a disabled reporter, right? Watch that footage and imagine what that would have done to any other person's campaign. Imagine President Obama 8 years ago doing that, right? Imagine Hillary Clinton today doing that. That's the end of the campaign. Trump has done a dozen things like that are so unpresidential, that show such poor judgment, such a lack of impulse control, such a pettiness, such narcissism, such emotional and intellectual immaturity. It would be inconceivable to promote such a person in any other context as the candidate of a major political party, and yet here we are with Trump. And I do share the view that has been expressed by many and that I actually expressed early on, that liberals, in their political correctness, are largely culpable for this, because we are all tired of political correctness. Being a bully and a braggart and a buffoon is not the only way to disavow political correctness. But I believe it is true that everyone's loss of patience with politically correct lies has allowed one of the most fraudulent and egocentric people who has ever walked the earth launch what is now an all too plausible bid for the presidency. And political correctness is even now confusing people about Trump. It's causing them to focus on the points of least concern, and in fact to remain blind to what is attractive about him for people. Take the case of the judge who was presiding over the Trump University lawsuit. This is the American-born judge who Trump has said can't cover the case fairly because of his Mexican heritage. And then when asked, do you think a Muslim judge could judge your case fairly? He said that might be a problem too, given what he has said about Muslims. And these two comments are being considered even by Republicans who have recently endorsed him to be totally beyond the pale. Paul Ryan said that these were textbook racist comments, though I think he's still endorsing him, which suggests something about Paul Ryan's principles. But these comments, more than anything else that Trump has said or done, seem to have rattled everybody, Democrat and Republican. But I think people are actually fixated on the wrong thing here. I watched those interviews with Trump, and I actually think it's possible to have a charitable interpretation of what he said and what he meant in those exchanges. Given the fact that he thinks he's being screwed over by a judge, I'm sure he's wrong about that, but let's just say that's his perception. It is possible to interpret what he said in a non-racist way. He's basically talking about bias. He's saying, listen, I want to build a wall between the U.S. and Mexico. This has made many Mexican Americans, or people with strong feelings on this topic, despise me. And so it is with the Muslim community for what I've said about immigration. So how could I expect to be judged fairly? What guarantee do I have that this judge isn't being ruled by a very understandable bias against me? So he was just speaking true to form without any concern for political correctness. And this is what people love about him. The people who love him love this. He is plain spoken. He's not going to bend an inch to accommodate the social anxieties of preachy social justice hypocrites. And that is his strength among the people who love him. You're not going to beat him by criticizing that. However, what is truly reprehensible here is his total unawareness of the legal and social implications of what he's suggesting should happen, right? Imagine if you could ask a judge who was white or a woman or black or old to recuse him or herself just based on one of these superficial characteristics and the possibility of bias. Our judicial system would grind to a halt. Totally unworkable, insane. Once again, absolute proof that Trump is just winging it. He has no idea what he's talking about. And so it is with everything else that he has suggested he wants to do or might want to do to the press or to other institutions in our society based on his presidential power. But to fixate on his racism here is to miss the actual danger of the guy, and also to fail to see that what you're calling racism is the very thing that the people who love him, who are craving honesty, love about him. And it's not that they are racist necessarily either. Yes, I'm sure all the racists in the country also love Trump for obvious reasons. So he's getting those votes too. But the crucial point to absorb here is that people who support him, even at moments like this, can do so without it being an expression of their own racism and without their perceiving racism in him. What I see in the love for Trump among smart people, right, not racist dummies, is a total loss of patience for political correctness. I'm sorry if this is boring to any of you. I'm well aware that this will make this podcast not age well, potentially. I hope that's the case. I hope you're coming to this podcast a year from now and are amazed that I'm squandering this much time talking about Donald Trump, who is now a year from now, a total non-entity, a laughingstock, right? Someone who is a footnote to a footnote describing how the superficiality and dishonesty of our public discourse turned our political process into a dangerous comedy. And now we've pulled back from the brink and we wonder, how was that even possible? I hope it soon seems strange that anyone was ever paying attention to Donald Trump, because it is, in fact, terribly and terrifyingly strange. But here we are. Just think for a second about one of his few concrete proposals. One is, in addition to building the wall, to round up the 11 to 12 million undocumented workers and send them back to Mexico or wherever else they came from. I talked about this on the Rogan podcast a little bit. This is such a stupid and unethical proposal that you would hope it would have ended his candidacy. Just take a moment to think about it. The true reason to be horrified by this is on the ethics. First, let me get a few of the silly canards out of the way. No one would dispute that if someone is in this country illegally and they are also a violent criminal, well, then of course we have to get them out of the country or get them into prison as quickly as possible. So if you point to the one person who came here from Guatemala and is now a prolific rapist, well, of course that person belongs in prison or belongs in a Guatemalan prison. But the vast majority of these people are simply doing jobs that most Americans don't want to do. So now look around you. Look at the housekeepers and the nannies you meet in the world. If you have young kids, you might meet a lot of these people. Imagine all of them who are undocumented, rounded up in the dead of night and deported, inevitably at gunpoint, because if these people don't want to go, as most of them won't, we're talking about the threat of deadly force knocking on the door. That's what these operations would look like. We're talking about the people who bus tables in your favorite restaurant, the guys you see working at a car wash, people who pick vegetables, people by the millions who do productive work that Americans do not, by and large, want to do. And many of these people have kids who are American citizens. So now we're talking about breaking up families. What does that look like? What does it look like to send the mother of a 4-year-old American citizen back to Mexico? How many tens of thousands of people will fall into that precise situation under this policy? And how many hundreds of thousands of stormtroopers would be required to enact it? We're talking about a terrifying authoritarian intrusion into our lives to bring this off. For the point of what? To get rid of rapists? No, to get rid of nannies. But ethics aside, think of the practical impediment to doing this. Think of the cost. Think of the law enforcement dollars not being spent on actually tracking down violent criminals if we spend our resources this way, rounding up generally peaceful and honest and incredibly industrious people, doing jobs we need done and don't want to do ourselves. I'll give you just 2 data points here to show you how far we are from living in a world where this is practically feasible, even if it were ethical and desirable, and it is totally unethical and undesirable. We have a Congress now which is dragging its feet on funding a response to the Zika virus outbreak the World Health Organization just advised people living in 46 countries to delay pregnancy because a mosquito bite delivered to a pregnant mother can lead to microcephaly in her children. Being born with a tiny head and a tiny brain and a commensurately tiny life. This is one of the horrors of nature delivered up to us that we must rely on human ingenuity to solve. And we can barely marshal a response because one of our political parties is pathologically afraid of raising taxes. But now we have their presidential candidate saying we are going to round up 11 million undocumented workers and send them back to Mexico. At what cost? Pure madness. Here's another data point. I have a friend who lives in a nice part of Los Angeles, right? A really nice part of Los Angeles. The average home price in her neighborhood is probably $5 million, right? So we're not talking about the hood. We're talking about the 1%. And I heard about this. I was blogging about crime and violence and self-defense, and this story was especially relevant to me. Then, in the middle of the day, someone kicks in her door, and luckily no one was home, and stole like $15,000 worth of electronic equipment, televisions and stereos, and also stole her iPad. Right. Well, so she comes home to this scene and discovers that her iPad is also gone, realizes she can track her iPad on the Apple website. So she opens her Apple account and sees, the glowing red orb of her iPad traveling across the city, right, and stopping permanently at a home like 10 miles from her own. Now, the police had already been to her home and she had filed a report and they told her they would work on the case. So now she calls them with the home address of the thieves, literally the Google Street View of their house. And the detective in charge said, "Sorry, we can't use that information." I was astonished when she told me this, right? I just couldn't believe this. Literally, you have the home address of the people who performed a burglary in one of the nicest neighborhoods in the city in the middle of the day. And you have no idea who these people are. You have no idea how violent they actually are. What would they have done had someone been home when they kicked in the door? I mean, is a fairly intrepid criminal who will kick in a door at 1 p.m. on a $5 million house and ransack it, right? This is not shoplifting. So I called Scotty Reitz, the former LAPD SWAT operator who I've done a lot of firearms training with, who I actually had on this podcast a while back. And I must say, he wasn't terribly surprised by this. He said, if you want to see if you can get something done for your friend, call the watch commander and tell him you're a writer and that you're writing about this and you want to talk about what happened here. So that's what I did. I called the watch commander and, honestly represented the fact that I'm writing about this kind of stuff. And I find this totally shocking. And you just explain yourself, right? How is this possible? Well, she can point you to the house of the person who did this. I gave him my credentials as a writer. I said, I don't know that I'm not going to write an LA Times or New York Times op-ed about this. I find this so shocking. And he just threw himself on my mercy. He said, listen, I would just ask you to be fair because I don't have the manpower for this. If I chased every stolen iPad, I would not be able to cover the violent crimes that are hitting my desk every hour. I said, wait a minute, but this isn't just an iPad. We don't know what these people would have done had they found someone in the house. This is a fairly aggressive burglary. And he said, I know, but I can't do it. Now, just map that reality onto Trump's proposal, and you will realize that it is so impractical as to be impossible. And if it were possible, it would be unethical and have disastrous consequences. And the problem with Trump is that virtually everything that he suggests he wants to do is like that. And please don't hear in my remarks on this topic a soft-hearted appeal for open borders. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm not on Maryam Namazi's side of the argument here. I think we should be able to control our borders. I highly doubt whether a wall is necessary to do that, but by all means, secure the borders. But The concern is with jihadists and Islamists, many of whom could come to this country on valid European passports. That's the concern. The concern isn't your best friend's nanny, who stands a very good chance of being undocumented. I just feel like I'm watching our country play a game of chicken, and there's no one in the other car. It's unnerving.